Good morning, Wabash. Today, speaking in Pioneer Chapel, we have Dr. Ethan Hollander with his talk titled Conversations with Criminals. Originally from Miami Beach, Dr. Hollander teaches courses in political science with a focus in comparative politics. Dr. Hollander's new book, Hegemony in the Holocaust, State Power and Jewish Survival in Occupied Europe, came out last year on Palgrave Press. Dr. Hollander and Dr. Tucker taught a brand new course on the Holocaust last semester, a course that had more than 60 students in it. Hollander also teaches classes on methods and statistics. Dr. Hollander is also an avid runner and knows that a lot of things are better when they are homemade, including yogurt and maple syrup. Please welcome Dr. Ethan Hollander.
In 2004, I interviewed a war criminal. His name was Maurice Papon, and he was convicted of crimes against humanity for collaborating with the Nazis in German-occupied France during World War II. And yes, just to get this out of the way, I am Jewish. I did have members of my family who were Holocaust survivors, and yes, this did lead to some interesting family dynamics. I remember when I first got the interview, I was so happy. I called my mom, like any good Jewish boy does, and I was so excited to tell her about this, and I get her on the phone, and if some of you have met my mom, you know that she is, how do I say this, consistent with stereotype. So I called her and I said, "Mom, I got an interview with Maurice Papon, the Nazi war criminal." And my mom said, "You're going to interview Maurice Papon? Is that what you're telling me, that some of your best friends are Nazis?" Anyway, it was all, eventually I was put back into the will, I think. Anyway, it all started when I was a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego. I was doing research on very traditional political science issues. I was studying international hierarchy and imperialism, and I was reading a lot of books with exciting titles like State Power and Hegemony in the title. And let me tell you, if you ever find a book that starts with the word hegemony, you should totally pick it up. It's a total page-turner. And so I did what any graduate student would do in such a situation. I procrastinated, right? I walked over to where the newspapers were, and I started to read the newspapers, and I came across the story of Maurice Papon. Now, Papon's story, his story was really interesting. He was essentially the governor of Bordeaux in German-occupied France during World War II, and he was on trial for his role as an accomplice to the Nazis. In the 1980s, documents emerged that unambiguously connected Papon with the deportations. And so I was really stunned, right? I didn't know what his defense was going to be. He stood accused of deporting 1,500 Jewish people to Auschwitz. Now, this story really drew me in. As I said, I had no idea what his defense was going to be. Well, his defense was fascinating. Papon essentially admitted to deporting 1,500 Jews. But he said that there were 10,000 Jewish people in Bordeaux at the time, and that had he deported nobody at all, he would have been fired and replaced with somebody who would have deported everybody. And so his claim was that actually by staying in office and helping the Germans a little bit, he was able to drag his feet and delay the deportations and ultimately serve the lesser of two evils. Now, this was a horrifying moral question, right? I didn't know if he was telling the truth, but what if he was telling the truth? What if it was true that if by staying in office and helping the Germans with the occupation, you could somehow serve a greater good? Even if it wasn't true of Papon's case, what if it was true just theoretically? Somehow, the more I thought about this question, the less I had a clear answer, the more troubling that question became. Right? That if some good could possibly come of collaboration, well, suddenly the question was a lot more complex. What was the right thing to do in a situation like that? And so I found myself pondering a question that I never thought I'd ask in the first place. And by the way, let me take a little aside here while I'm on that issue. I'm talking to gentlemen at a small liberal arts college. A lot of you will go home over summer break, and people will ask, "You're taking a class in that, right? What is that ever going to do for you?" And I just want to say that I didn't end up answering the question that I thought I would ask either, right? I started off by taking an interest in the world around me, right, by procrastinating. And that led me to places and led me to trying to answer questions that I never thought I'd have, right? So why are you studying a liberal arts education? I don't know. And in fact, you can't possibly know, because it'll lead you to places that I suspect will be good, but that you can't possibly ever predict what they will be. Well, in my case, that place was Germany. And so I found myself in Germany doing research on the question that I didn't even start with. Well, in Germany, I was affiliated with a research institute, the Center for Research on Antisemitism, Das Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung, which in German is less of a mouthful because in German it's just one word. And I remember when I got there, I met with the director of the institute, and I asked him, is there a way that I could have a desk or an office or somewhere where I could, sit and do my research? And he was very accommodating. He said, look, in the library, there's, what amounted to an old storage closet. He said, we don't really use that anymore. The books that are stacked up in the desk up there, we don't really use those either. So just set them aside, and you can use that. Now, I have to say, after negotiating all this with the director of this research institute in German, I had this newfound confidence in my ability to speak in German. I mean, I'd taken it in school, I'd studied it a little bit, but that's not the same. And unless I was talking about stuff that was directly related to the stuff I was studying, unless I was talking about World War II or the Holocaust, my vocabulary was very limited, right? And so here I negotiated this whole thing about the office, the desk, in German. I was very proud of myself. And so I waltzed into the library, and I found the closet, and I started stacking the books outside. And by the way, when I had talked to the director, he said, look, if the librarian asks you what you're doing, just tell her I said it was okay. Right, so I go into the library and I stack the books outside. The librarian does come up to me and she does ask what I'm doing. And I, in my very proud, newly confident German, proclaimed, these inferior books must be deported immediately and subjected to appropriate measures. My conquest of this closet is nearly complete, and I intend to occupy it forthwith. She was puzzled, she was horrified. I thought I would sort of calm her down, so I said, oh, don't worry, this operation has been approved at the highest levels. I spoke to the Fuhrer this morning. She hadn't heard anybody speaking in German this way for like 60 years, right? It was a peculiar way of putting things, but it did get the job done. And so I found myself digging in the archives in Berlin, and about 2 years later, I felt like I had the answer to my question. And it turns out, surprisingly, that Papon's story really did kind of check out, at least on a national level. If you look at Vichy France during the war, a country where people like Maurice Papon stayed in office and collaborated, well, the survival rate of Jewish people in Vichy France was about 75%. And that compares to about 20% elsewhere in Europe. And so on a national level, of course, this pattern, I think, held, right? There was the case that, in fact, where local leaders stayed in office and helped the Germans, say, with military and economic affairs, for whatever reason, Jewish survival rates were higher. Now, of course, I didn't know exactly why this was the case, and I certainly didn't want to attribute it to any good intentions on the part of the collaborators. It could have just been accidental. It could have been that the collaborators were less efficient than the Germans were. In fact, even if they did set out to protect Jews for the right reasons, it's not really clear that they might have done so for the right reasons, right? They might have been crass political opportunists who did it because they were bribed. instead of because they thought it was somehow the right thing to do. And in fact, whatever their motives, it's hard to get away from the fact that if people stayed in office and helped the Germans with the occupation, they were indirectly helping the German war effort on other fronts, right? Germany devoted fewer troops to countries where it had a local government helping it out. And so I certainly wasn't making a moral judgment here, right? But I had noticed the pattern, and that pattern was fascinating to me. It had tremendous moral dilemmas. Well, so I found myself thinking a lot about Papon, thinking about the collaborators, thinking about what their motives might have been. And so I decided, well, if I wanted to know more about why the collaborators did what they did, I should just ask a collaborator. And so I wrote a letter to Maurice Papon's lawyer, and shockingly, I got a reply. Now, I actually have the letter here. I kind of want to read it to you, actually, but it's in French. Garçon?
Cher Monsieur Hollander, mon ami Maurice Papon serait très heureux de vous recevoir et de répondre aux questions que vous avez pour lui s'être posées. Je pense que cette rencontre sera très instructive. Pour le cas de Maurice Papon, illustre parfaitement votre propos. Toutefois, je dois vous signaler que s'il a conservé ses facultés mentales pratiquement intactes, c'est aujourd'hui un très vieil homme et qu'il serait donc souhaitable que vous tardiez pas trop. Très cordialement, Jean-François Steiner.
He speaks tremendously good French for a guy who was born in Indiana. But, you know, Lebanon, Indiana, right? Well, if that sounds like a yes, it was. Right? I got the interview. I was shocked by this, right? Now, Maurice Papon at this point lived in a villa just outside of Paris. He'd been convicted of crimes against humanity, and he served a short sentence in prison, but at age 93, he was released to serve out the remainder of his sentence under house arrest. And so when I met Papon, it was at his home. He had a friend with him. I had a friend with me who was also my translator. And for the better part of 2 days, we talked. I remember thinking that he looked old. I mean, he was 93 after all. I also remember that he looked remarkably well for a man who'd just been released from prison on account of his ill health. I also remember being nervous, right? I was nervous partly because of the gravity of the situation, partly because of who he was. And I was nervous also because I didn't want to come off as a collaborator, as an apologist for these people, right? I was not making a moral judgment about whether they collaborated intentionally or about what their reasons might have been, and certainly not about whether it might have been justified in the end. And so I wasn't doing that, but I was afraid that it might be seen that way, right? I really had an honest question. I was curious if this pattern existed, and I was curious about what he might say. I hadn't yet lived in the Midwest, right? I wasn't yet versed in that fine art of disguising an answer as a question, right? For me, it really was a question, but I was afraid that it might not be seen that way, and so I was nervous. And anyway, so I found myself nervously sitting across the table from a guy I never thought I'd meet, doing research for a topic I never thought I'd do, on a question that I never imagined I would ask. And so I started by asking Papon about what he did during the war, and he very quickly turned it to the issue at hand. He claimed that by being slightly disloyal in his collaboration with Nazi Germany, he was actually able to serve the greater good and to help the resistance. For example, he said that he gave information to the resistance and that this was information that he never would have even seen had he given up his post. And in fact, he also said that he was able to help local Jewish people in France by, for example, striking names off of an arrest list. And he said that was an arrest list that I never would have seen had I not remained in office. And so his claim was actually particularly radical, right? It was particularly bold. It wasn't just that he didn't do the wrong thing. It was that by staying in office, he actually did the right thing, because by stepping down, he would have been giving up an opportunity to serve the greater good. He actually said that he would have felt like a coward had he stepped down. Now, of course, I asked Papon if he had evidence for this, and surprisingly, and maybe even troublingly, he did. He said that there was a member of the resistance, somebody who actually happened to be Jewish, who he sheltered in his home during the war. And in fact, that member of the resistance came forward in Papon's defense during the trial. And he also said that there were internal German memos, memos that the occupying Germans had written that said that Papon couldn't be trusted because he was too friendly with the Allies and too friendly particularly with the Americans. And he kind of looked at me and he slapped me on the knee. He said, "See, boy, even the Germans knew that I liked Americans." Well, in a way, this was all very disappointing, right? It would have been very easy if he didn't have good answers to my questions, right? Because then I could have just thanked him for his time and for his hospitality, and I could have written him off. But the fact that he had answers, again, whether his answers were true, at least opened the possibility that somewhere in Europe, somewhere in an occupying regime, there was a collaborator who did the right thing for the right reasons. And so long as that was even theoretically possible, this was a difficult moral question, and it made it harder, not easier, to judge him. Well, the second day of talking was a lot more chill. We'd gotten past that sort of initial nervousness, and at that point, we were really just talking. He asked us about what we did. He showed us pictures of his grandchildren, and he actually brought out fine scotch, and he proposed a toast. And I have trouble saying it, right? But if I'm really true to myself, it was fun. And even harder to say is the fact that I liked him, right? That it was fun talking to him. It was like talking to an old World War II veteran about that person's experiences, only in this case, it's not your great uncle, the decorated war hero, right? But Maurice Papon, the convicted war criminal. Well, people still ask me if I believe Maurice Papon. And even these many years later, that's an open question. I mean, I take Papon at his word that yes, at some point, he helped the resistance. Although exactly when he did so, and whether he only did so when it was clear that Germany was going to lose the war anyway, well, that's hard to say. In fact, I even believe that he might have helped local Jews by staying at his office, right? Although whether he did so for the right reasons, well, that's open to debate as well. But whatever the claim, it's hard to square those with the notion that a better person would have refused to cooperate with Nazi Germany in the first place, right? And that people who resisted from day one don't have to tell such nuanced stories about what they did during the war. Now, people also ask me if I think that Maurice Papon was anti-Semitic. Well, I don't have an answer to that either, right? Was it Maurice Papon anti-Semitic? I don't know. By today's standards, yes. But then again, by today's standards, and this is really true, maybe I'm anti-Semitic, right? Because I sometimes refer to people as Jews instead of as Jewish human beings of nondescript gender identity, right? Right, the discourse is so heated right now, right? And people bandy about terms like racism and anti-Semitism and sexism and homophobia so freely that at some point I've lost track of what these things really mean. And it's worth saying that those very same things, there are people who deny that they even exist. even when it's so clearly obvious that they do, right? And so in this kind of discourse, in some ways, and I'm a political scientist, right, I just give up. I have no way of judging that kind of thing. All right, people also ask me, so they asked me if I thought he was anti-Semitic. They asked me if I thought, if I believed him. And I think I've come to realize now that when people ask me if I think Maurice Papon did the right thing, they're not actually asking me if I think he's telling the truth, right? They're asking me if I think he did the right thing, right? Now that's a complicated question. That's an open question. In fact, you might call it an enduring question. Many of you know I'm teaching this new class. It's a class that I've kind of developed called Enduring Questions 2.0. I see a few of you in the audience. Enduring Questions 2.0, it's EQ for seniors. Now, if you remember EQ when you were freshmen, a lot of you read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Well, in EQ 2.0, we read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's letters from prison. Now, like Martin Luther King, Bonhoeffer was a clergyman, right? He was a Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany during the war. And he was an opponent of the Nazis. But unlike Maurice Papon, he worked very actively with the resistance. But this posed a dilemma for Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a very religious man. He firmly believed that murder was wrong, no matter what the circumstance. And yet he also, as an opponent of the Nazis, realized that the only way to stop the Nazi regime was to participate in a plot to assassinate Hitler. This was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's enduring question, right? And his answer to the question is the thing that eventually got him imprisoned and for which he was eventually executed by the Nazis. Now, to me, Maurice Papon and Dietrich Bonhoeffer personify in some ways the two responses that countries could take to German occupation. You could resist the German occupation fully, and you would be crushed, right? And everybody in your country, Jewish people and non-Jewish people alike, would suffer from the full brutality of a direct German occupation. Or you could collaborate a little bit. You could collaborate with an evil regime and hope that by helping the Germans a little bit in military and economic affairs, you were maybe able to serve a greater good. Now that's the enduring question that stuck with me. And so I end with a question, right? I end with the same question in some ways that I started with, and you know what? For what it's worth, I think that's totally okay. I think answers are overrated. Do not test me on this when I give you a test and you get something wrong. The same rules do not apply. But in the real world, I think that actually answers are overrated, but a question, right? If you get the really right question, now that's something to ponder. Was Papon guilty, or was he not guilty? Or was he maybe somehow a little bit of both? Well, I don't know. I don't have to decide. Now, a court of law, a court has to decide, right? A court renders a verdict, and a court, whether you like it or not, is going to render a verdict guilty or not guilty. And interestingly, in Papon's case, the court kind of decided both, because he was convicted on some accounts and acquitted on others. But more often than not, right, the court has to deliver a verdict, and if you think about that, that kind of either-or distinction is an artificial thing that we impose on a world that's much more messy and hard to pin down, right? Answers are closed. Solutions are final. But questions are open, and they're inviting, and they're humble. I mean, there's a reason we don't call the class Enduring Answers, right? Answers aren't enduring. Answers are arrogant, right? And they have this kind of unnatural finality to them, right? Answers bring on overconfidence, and they bring on hubris. Questions, spark inquiry, and they spark investigation. And if there's anything that I've learned from my studies of the Holocaust or from my conversations with criminals, it's that people with questions are a lot less dangerous than people with answers.